Tonight we're talking about ridge soaring. And there's a nice picture of a paraglider enjoying some smooth coastal ridge lift. The smoothest ridge lift you'll ever find. Simply put, ridge lift is just wind plus a slope. But we'll get into a good bit more details about it than that, of course. There are no particular prerequisites that I would consider for tonight's lecture. No course lectures that you need to have before this one, no practical exercises that it would be best to have before this one, because the course is primarily on thermaling. It's also on cross-country flying, and ridge soaring can come into play there. Well, let's start by defining ridge lift. You'll also hear it called slope lift. I may call it that some. And if someone's in a mood to use big words, they might call it orographic lift. It's all the same thing. It's just wind hitting a slope and being deflected upward. Tonight we're going to talk about what causes ridge lift, what defines or affects the nature of ridge lift, and this of course will help answer the important question of when and where you'll find ridge lift. We'll also talk about how to use ridge lift, and how you go about using it depends on what your purpose is. For example, you might be trying to maximize your cross-country speed, and that would call for one way of using it. Or you might just be trying to get as high as you can and stay as high as you can, and that would call for a little bit different tactic. We'll also talk about what happens when ridge lift is combined with other things like thermals, or the sun, or even wave lift. They can all interact. So we'll talk about what happens when they do. And of course we'll talk about the hazards of ridge soaring, things to beware. And related to that somewhat, we'll talk about ridge soaring right-of-way rules, so we can all play nice together in the limited area of ridge lift. So let's start by talking about what causes ridge lift, what defines its nature, what affects it. In short, it's wind and slope, but we can get a little more detailed than that. We'll talk about several basic factors that affect ridge lift, and we'll get into each one in a little more detail later. Wind, of course, is pretty important. The direction of the wind relative to the slope is important. Speed of the wind, of course, is important. If there's zero wind, there's zero ridge lift. There are some characteristics of the ridge that are important. The ridge length. How many miles long is this ridge? That matters. The contour, and what I mean by that is a cross-sectional shape. If you looked at it horizontally, looking down the ridge, and took a slice through it and looked at that shape is important. And the smoothness of the surface. So, is it a bare ridge that's just smoothly tapered, or is it like our ridges here in the east, covered with trees, which is not smooth, it's bumpy? So we'll talk about all of those things. We'll start with wind direction. So here on the right side of the screen, top to bottom, is a very simple ridge. It's left-right symmetrical from our view. The dark line is the top or the crest of the ridge, and it slopes down to the left and down to the right. A very simplistic ridge. And we're going to look at wind direction with this very simple ridge. What's most important is the component of the wind that's directly into the ridge. So if you take the wind vector and break it down into a vector perpendicular to the ridge or into the ridge, and a vector parallel to the ridge or along the ridge. That's what we're doing here. And the most important thing is that vector component that is directly into the ridge. So for example, in our ideal scenario with the wind straight into the ridge, if you do that vector analysis, you get a zero vector parallel to the ridge, and 100% of the wind strength is in the vector perpendicular to the ridge. That's what we like, straight in. If the wind is 45-degree cross, for example, well, you get a non-zero parallel vector. Turns out it's about 70% of the wind speed, as is the straight in component. And here's a chart that just does that math for you for any wind direction relative to this ridge. So you can see over at 90 degrees, the straight in wind component is 0% of the wind speed. That just means the wind is blowing straight down the ridge, parallel to the ridge. There's no wind blowing into the ridge. Over at 0, it's 100%, and you see this nice curve. What you might find interesting about this curve is it's at to get what angle gives you half of the wind speed blowing straight into the ridge, and that angle is 60 degrees. So it can be cross to the ridge, 60 degrees, blowing more parallel than perpendicular at the point where this simple vector analysis gives you half of the wind strength blowing straight into the ridge. Interesting fact, but that doesn't quite tell the whole story, because the ridge doesn't just deflect the air upward. If the wind is blowing into it at an angle, then it also turns the wind, changes the wind's direction. So reality is probably more like this red line. I wouldn't argue with you if you said move it up or down a little bit, but it's roughly something like this. So in this you can see pretty much at a 45-degree angle, you're down to about half the wind strength blowing straight into the ridge. Maybe the next most important thing is wind speed. And it's simply the stronger wind equals stronger ridge lift. Zero wind, zero ridge lift. And it's a pretty simple relationship. It's probably pretty close to 1-to-1, directly proportional. Double the wind speed, double the ridge lift strength. It's probably not exactly true, but close. Also, stronger wind will cause the ridge lift to go to a higher altitude. So the stronger the wind is, all else being equal, you'll be able to climb higher in the ridge lift. But that relationship is probably not quite as simple as, double the wind speed equals double the height. Next, let's look at the ridge length. And here we have two examples. One is essentially a zero length ridge. This circular one here in the lower middle of the screen, you can think of it as looking like a cone. There's no length at the top of the ridge. And with ridges like this tend to not produce much usable ridge lift, almost no matter how strong the wind is. Because the wind doesn't just go up the ridge, it will go around it. Like we were talking about before, if the wind is not straight into a slope, the slope will turn it. Well, if you look from the wind's point of view here, as it flows toward the left side of this ridge here, it's actually flowing cross to the slope, because the slope is here at this point. So that will turn the wind. But that's not the only thing that will turn the wind, because look over here at this longer ridge. It's not infinite length. It has ends, but the wind is straight into it. Yet the wind direction will still turn some and go toward the end. In the middle of the ridge, it's more or less straight, and at the ends, it will turn out toward the end. If you haven't done this before, next time you're driving in your car and it's raining, leave your wipers off long enough to let the water start flowing and following its streamlines, and you'll see this. You'll see that in the middle of your windshield, the rain goes straight up the middle of the car, the middle of the windshield. To the right of there, it will move a little bit right as it goes up, and to the left of there, it'll move a little left as it goes up. It's the same phenomenon. The air basically compresses in front of the ridge, and so out here it's relatively low pressure, which lets the air go out there. It's basically the same concept as what causes span-wise flow on a wing. Under the wing, you get increased pressure, and so you get some flow outboard toward the tip. And on the top, where it's low pressure, you get inboard flow. And this is what causes our wing tip vortices. So this is sort of the equivalent of that with a ridge. And now let's talk about the cross-section or contour of the ridge. Simple rule is the steeper the slope, the stronger and higher the lift will go above that slope. It's not too hard to see why that is. Beware a sharp knee, what I'm calling a knee, and I've drawn one in this image right here, is the knee. This is not the highest point on the mountain, but it's a sharp transition in slope. And with a sharp knee like that, you can get this rotor turbulence, like I've drawn here. And it's in front of the crest. The crest is the highest point of the mountain, which is here, or at least somewhere off the screen to the right. So if that knee is sharp enough and the wind is strong enough, you can get a standing rotor there. So beware of that. You don't want to get too low just behind a sharp knee. Not only will you not find ridge lift there, you might find some big sink. And it can be surprising. The best lift is with a sharp knee. The best lift can be below the crest, so lower than the highest point on the ridge, and well in front of the highest point on the ridge, out in front of or slightly over this knee. The place where I've done the most of my ridge soaring has a contour not quite this extreme, but similar to that. We called that knee the secondary ridge, and often we would ridge soar that, and the ridge lift would be better there than up higher, up over the crest, where the ridge was pretty shallow. Next, there's the issue of the smoothness or roughness of the ridge surface. A bare, smooth slope is the best. So a lot of the desert ridges with very little vegetation on them, if the ridge is continuous enough and doesn't have a lot of breaks in it and gaps, that tends to be the best ridge lift, the most pleasant to fly in, rather, the smoothest. You might even get a little more lift for a given wind speed because you don't have all this vegetation slowing the wind down. But the main thing is you'll notice the difference in turbulence. I don't know that I have ridge soared out west just a few times at the point of the mountain in Utah, but other than that, all my flying has been in the east. So I'm taking this mostly from others who have done a good bit of ridge soaring in a number of places, and this is what I hear from them, that when they fly these tree-covered ridges, they're the bumpiest. So yeah, trees, boulders, any other kind of irregularities in the slope surface can just create mechanical turbulence as the air rolls over them. It can weaken the lift and make the air less smooth. At a minimum, this extra turbulence means you need more airspeed for safety, which of course reduces your climb rate. So let's summarize some of that and think about what it says about when and where to find ridge lift. You need wind, and how much wind depends on some of the below factors. The straighter the wind is into the slope, the better. So the straighter it is into the slope, the less wind you need. The longer the ridge and the farther from its end you are, the better. If I had to guess, I would say if you're at least half a mile from an end of the ridge, you're probably not going to notice much turning of the wind. It's really only right there at the ends that you might notice the lift weakening as wind sort of spills around the end of the ridge instead of going over it. The steeper the slope is, the better it is at creating ridge lift from a given strength and direction of wind. So you need less wind with a steeper slope. And a smoother slope will make it where you need a little bit less wind, and it'll just make it a more pleasant experience. But we often can't choose that. To change that, we might have to get in the car and drive a few hundred miles. So some rough numbers, 10 to 15 miles an hour, most average ridges work. 5 to 10 miles an hour might get you some usable ridge lift if the ridge is particularly steep. Only the shallowest ridges need 20 miles an hour to be soarable. So there's some rough numbers, assuming the wind is straight in. So let's talk about how to use ridge lift. One of the two basic things you might want to do with ridge lift is just get high. Maybe you aren't trying to go cross country, you're just hanging out, enjoying the flight, and you just want to see how high you can get. But unless thermals are poor right now, or the ridges are really high, and by really high I mean several thousand feet above the valley, then ridge lift is not the typical way to get high. If you're wanting to get as high as possible, thermals are almost always the answer, unless there's exceptional wave conditions here today. Try to find the area where the ridge lift goes the highest. And remember, if the ridge has a strong knee to it, then the strongest lift is probably going to be near the knee, but the highest lift might be nearer the crest. So in a situation like this, you might want to work that knee until you climb up high enough to get back over the crest, and then eke your way up to as high as you can get. We call this stepping up. Look for the part of the ridge that faces the wind the best. And so a steeper slope, spot that faces the wind the best, that's probably going to be your best spot to get the highest. And if your goal is simply get as high as you can to see the biggest number on your altimeter, then you want to fly at minimum sink speed. That will let you peak out as high as possible in this lift. Now, make sure you hear me. I'm not saying fly at minimum sink speed close to terrain. But once you're a few hundred feet above terrain, you can afford to slow down, especially if there's no traffic around. But when you're trying to absolutely peak it out, minimum sink speed will get you there. But what if you want to use ridge lift to go fast? And that's what you'll be doing if you get into cross-country flying, especially racing. You're not going to be trying to fly around at minimum sink speed and loiter over this ridge forever to try to get the highest number on your altimeter, you're going to want to you're going to want to finish this task as fast as you can. And to do that, you need to fly the ridge lift differently. Unlike the case for trying to get high, unless thermal conditions are really good, ridge soaring can often be the way to go to increase your cross-country speed. You don't have to, it doesn't take much ridge lift at all in a sailplane to be able to fly at best glide speed, to average your best glide speed without ever turning. Doesn't take much. But think about what sort of an average climb rate in thermals it takes to be able to do that same thing, to average that same speed. So it doesn't take much ridge lift for that to be your best way to get the highest average course speed. Assuming that your course is laid out relatively close to the orientation of the ridge. So you never know. At a contest, the task setter may be generous and give you a leg that runs right down a nice soarable ridge, or he may toy with you and put the ridge somewhere put the task somewhere that the ridge is not necessarily the best place to go because you have to take a big detour to get there. So you never know what you'll get. Sometimes the ridge is a good place to go, sometimes maybe not if it's way off course. But if you're flying for speed, you want to find the area of strongest ridge lift, but I mean this a little differently than I did on the last slide. On the last slide, I basically meant find the point on the ground where the ridge lift is the best. What I mean here is imagine looking at a profile, cross-section of the ridge, and try to find the spot in that profile where the ridge lift is the strongest. So you think of it as sort of a tunnel. Now we call it a lift band. This tunnel you have in your mind that you're trying to stay in. And it typically is slightly above and in front of the highest part of the steepest part of the ridge. So again, if you have this ridge with a knee, you might, depending on how high the rest of the ridge is and how steep it ends up being up at the top, you might be better off down in front of that knee. Just upwind and slightly above that knee may be where the lift is the strongest. Yeah, there we go. I got ahead of myself. And what you're looking for is you're looking for the spot, this tunnel, if you will, the spot in our cross-section picture of the ridge where you can fly the fastest and stay right there. Getting ahead of myself again. You want to experiment and find the spot that lets you fly the fastest and hold altitude. And you just fly whatever speed keeps you in that position. And that's how you maximize your speed in ridge lift. Often a guy who's a few hundred feet higher in ridge lift, if he's a few hundred feet above the ridge, he's going slower than the guy who's down lower to the ridge. So higher is not necessarily faster. And you might as well ignore McCready's speed to fly theory when you're running a ridge. It really doesn't matter. About the only thing I will sometimes do with my flight computer and the McCready setting while I'm running the ridge is So another thing you can do with ridge lift, aside from just trying to get as high as you can or trying to cover ground as quickly as you can, is to use it to experiment with lift lines. I have a couple of lectures on lift lines, and I mentioned this in those, but you can use this to learn. Spend some time learning about how to find lift lines. And in ridge soarable conditions, 10 knot or more winds, lift lines, these parallel to the wind thermal lift lines like cloud streets. Cloud streets are really strong examples of lift lines, but there are lift lines on plenty of days when there are not cloud streets or even clouds. But in ridge soarable conditions with some thermals, you can expect there to be lift lines. So troll the ridge looking for them. And basically, when you come across a better area of ridge lift, maybe a quarter to half a mile wide area of ridge lift that's better, and you see no explanation for it. The ridge isn't shaped any differently here, it's not turned a different direction, nothing. There's nothing to explain why this section of ridge has better lift over it, but it does. You may even fly all the way through it, turn around and come back all the way through it again, and wow, it's better. But maybe not good enough to call it a real thermal. There's a good chance that's a lift line. So when you find such a thing, turn into the wind, fly upwind, and try to ride that line. Sense for falling off to the right or falling off to the left, and make corrections. And there's a good chance that that's where you'll find a good thermal, is on that line. So if you're bored, this is something good for fighting ridge soaring boredom, is look for lift lines. Let's talk a little about some imperfections in ridges. This is part of the topography of the Sequatchie Valley. And what you see here, there's valley on the left and plateau in the lower right corner. And here's a big gap or break in the ridge. It's probably a mile across, half a mile to a mile across. When you come upon a gap like this, if the wind is not perfectly square to the ridge, it's not blowing straight in, then expect to find better lift on the side of the gap that faces into the wind better. So in this example, that would be this side of the gap. It faces the wind a little better than this side of the gap. Neither one faces the wind as well as the ridge in general. And beware the Venturi effect. We talked before about the ridge can turn the wind. Well, in the case of a gap like this side of the gap will turn the wind this way, and this south side of the gap will turn the wind this way. So you get a convergence of sorts of just pure wind in the back of this gap. So you get a Venturi effect where the wind is accelerated in the back of the gap. So be particularly wary of that. You guys are all sailplane pilots, so it's not as big an issue as if you were flying a much slower paraglider or hang glider. For paragliders and hang gliders, we are very sensitive to this. We could get trapped at the back of the gap and not be able to get out. Also, if you're coming upon this gap, you might want to slow down a touch if it's a big enough gap and try to gain a little bit of altitude before you cross it, just to help make sure you get to the other side in lift. You also probably don't want to just follow it around all the way through the back. One, because of the Venturi effect, and one, if you're racing anyway, you want the shorter distance. As long as you can cross it without losing too much altitude and dropping well below the good lift band, go across it. So if I were crossing headed northeast, I might slow down a little bit right here and then aim for maybe here, cut across to there. If I were coming at it headed southwest, I might slow down a little here, right here, points into the wind nicely. Might even get lucky and find a nice thermal there. And then I'd cut across. I might even aim for a little upwind, because in this case the wind is almost straight down the ridge here. Might be kind of sinky here, so I might even aim out a little and then tuck back in on the other side. But you want to get across the ridge, the gap rather, high enough to still connect with the ridge lift. And just because there's ridge lift up at the top of the mountain doesn't mean there's ridge lift 500 feet lower. Here in this particular topography of the Sequatchie Valley, the ridge flattens out a good bit. It's hard for you to tell, but it's fairly steep right up here at the top, and then that is fairly flat for a while, so there is not much good ridge lift right in here. So you can only afford to lose a couple hundred feet going across that ridge if you were at ridge height, going across that gap. The wider and deeper the gap, the more it's going to reduce the lift in the gap. Part of it is, look how shallow the slope is, all the way up to right about here at the top. There may be decent lift here, but again, because of the Venturi, I don't recommend necessarily trying to find out. But out here, as you cut straight across the gap, of course, there may not be much good lift right here. So sometimes there is, but don't count on it. So let's look at what happens in ridge lift when you combine it with some other factors. Thermals, for example. Thermals don't care whether there's ridge lift, other than ridge lift can help trigger them, but thermals can come from upwind of the ridge lift, drift right through it, up and over the ridge, and keep on going. Thermals can be spawned right there on the upwind side of the ridge, and they can be stationary source types or drifting source types. Either way, in simple terms, the thermal adds to the ridge lift. So if you're in the lifting part of the thermal, the good part of the thermal, and it's in ridge lift, then it's probably going to be better than if you were in either one of them alone. They're somewhat additive. If you're in the ridge lift but outside the edge of the thermal in the sinky area, then your ridge lift is going to be worse while that thermal passes through, because the sink from the thermal is fighting the lift from the ridge, and it may just wash out to be nothing. No lift at all. Maybe no sink, but no lift. And of course the thermals make the ridge lift more turbulent. So you may have just been boating up and down in smooth ridge lift, and here comes a thermal through. It makes things turbulent. It may have been my very first ridge soaring flight in a hang glider. We have this small section of ridge, about a half to 3/4 of a mile of ridge, so it didn't take very long to go from one end to the other. I went down the ridge once, and about midpoint there was turbulence. I guess it was a thermal. And I got white-knuckled. I did not like it. I kept flying straight, went on through it, came out the other side, it got smooth again. Got to the end of my ridge, turned around, went back through it again. White-knuckled again, same thing. Came out the other side, got to the end of my ridge, turned, and I said, if this happens a third time, I'm going to land. It did, and I did. I landed. So it's funny, in the beginning, turbulence is unwelcome. Now, if I hit that thermal, I would smile and turn and climb in it, but it chops up the smoothness of your ridge lift for sure. Use lift lines, like I mentioned before, to try to find where your next thermal may be, because a lot of the times when we're in ridge lift, we're wanting to get out of it. We're wanting to get higher. and not be stuck down here low to the ridge all day. So look for lift lines. Try to go up them, hoping for a thermal upwind of you. The farther upwind you can find your thermal, the higher you'll be above the crest of the ridge once you drift back to it. So that's safer. This is a big issue for slower flying aircraft like paragliders and hang gliders. If you hang out right at the crest of the ridge as high as you can be, then when a thermal comes through, you might only get to make 2 or 3 circles before you've drifted so far that now you have to leave your thermal to maintain a safe glide upwind to clear the ridge. But if you top out like that, get as high as you can, then find your lift line or whatever line thermals have been tending to come down, go up that, press upwind as far as you can and still be able to get back to the ridge lift, and look for your thermals that way. If you don't find one, you come back to the ridge at ridge height, climb back up in the ridge lift, run out and do it again. And sometimes it would have to be really high wind situations probably in a sailplane for this to be necessary, but in paragliders and hang gliders, that was often the only way you could ever get very high in a thermal on a day with moderate wind and thermals that aren't terribly strong. Sun has an effect on ridge lift too. The sun heats the slopes that face it more directly the most intensely. So a sun-facing slope will have a little bit stronger lift on it than a less sunny slope. So if the sun is to the south and the wind is from the south and you're soaring a ridge, life is good because the sun is helping the wind. But if you're soaring on a north wind day and the sun is to the south, well, now the slope you're soaring is kind of shaded or at least less sunny. So the sun is not helping the wind. In fact, it may be hurting it. So all else being equal, with the sun in the southern sky, you would prefer to be ridge soaring with a south wind. You'd prefer the sun and the wind to be coming from the same direction. This concept means that east-facing slopes are helped by this in the morning and west-facing slopes in the afternoon. Now let's look at the interaction of wave lift with ridge lift. So here we have sort of a textbook wave scenario, wind from left to right, and we see about a wave and a half here. And under the crests of the waves you have a rotor that naturally sets up. So we're going to look at a few different ridge positions and what the experience would be if you were here, soaring a ridge that's here. So we'll start with you soaring a ridge and you are directly under the crest, the high point of a wave. Because of the rotor that's under the crest of this wave, you're going to feel less wind there than if the wave weren't here. Because the rotor, you're at the bottom of the rotor where the rotor is pushing against the wind. So your ridge lift is going to be worse than if this wave weren't parked right over your ridge. If you're on the downside of the wave, then your wind may not be affected much, but there will be diminished lift because there's a negative vertical component to the air here. And this can be puzzling. If you go fly on a day with plenty of wind, you know that this ridge has proven itself soarable in this same amount of wind several times, yet today, for some reason, it's this windy, but there's not much ridge lift. And this can happen if your ridge is under the downside of a wave. We believe this happens in the Sequatchie Valley fairly often. There are days when the wind is blowing and the ridge lift just stinks. If you happen to be at the trough then there will be more wind. There's sort of a venturi of sorts here. One, wind from higher altitudes is being brought down, and that wind has more speed. But two, there's somewhat of a compression zone here, and a venturi type effect. So right here you'd have more wind, and there's no lifting or sinking component, so you're just going to have more ridge lift here than you would have if the wave weren't involved. You might also find that you have more wind in this scenario than was forecasted. And if you're under the upside, that's where we'd like to be. If you're under the upside of the wave, then you can expect for the same amount of wind for the ridge lift to be better, because it's really not all ridge lift. You're getting a vertical boost from the wave action. So let's get into some of the dangers, some things to be aware of, how to fly ridges safely. Maybe the most obvious one is you're close to the ground a lot. You may not be close to the altitude of your airport, but you're close to terrain. And you're close to possibly some man-made structures on the top of this ridge. People like to put towers on top of ridges. Just a few miles west of our flying site here, there are some towers that are 1,000 feet tall or so, and they'll reach up and spook you if you get over in that area and you forgot about them. They're way up there. And guy wires can stretch out a long way and be all but invisible. But maintain adequate ground clearance. That's the number one rule for just the terrain closeness. But also look out for these tall objects that stand up above the trees or the bare ground if you're flying somewhere with bare ground. High voltage lines, they can sometimes sneak up on you too. Though they don't stick up as high as most of these towers. But and pay attention to your airspeed, especially if you're flying with a little bit of a tailwind. When you're low to the ground like that, you get quite a sensation of speed compared to being a few thousand feet off the deck. And so you may, without thinking about it, start gauging your speed by how fast the trees are going by. And this can be especially troublesome with a crossing wind on the ridge and you going back and forth. So when you're going partially upwind, your ground speed is lower at a given airspeed. When you're going partially with a tailwind, your ground speed is higher. That's when people get into trouble, is on that partially tailwind leg after they turn around and they see themselves starting to pick up speed and slow down instinctively. So airspeed is king here, not ground speed. You don't want to stall into the trees with a tailwind. On the windward side or the upwind side of the ridge, there can be considerable turbulence from things like we've talked about before. The roughness, so trees, any undulations in the ridge, gaps, thermals, and in a sailplane where you're zipping along at 80 to 100 knots, these are like, I'm told, because I haven't had this experience yet other than in Condor, which doesn't throw my seat around, that it can be like hitting potholes and you can go negative. So cinch your straps down tight if you plan to be doing some close to the ridge fast flying to keep yourself from smacking your head on the canopy. And even if you're not racing, you definitely want to fly fast enough to deal with whatever turbulence comes along. The lower you are to the trees, the faster you better be flying, because you can't afford the wing to move much if it's really close to the terrain already. And like I mentioned before, beware the knees in ridges and the rotor that can sometimes stand up just downwind and above them. The lee side is worse. You generally don't want to be there. The downwind side of the ridge will have air going back down, sinking, and often enough, depending on the shape of the backside of the ridge, there will be a rotor there if you get low, just below the ridge height. Basically, don't go there unless you're pretty high. If you're approaching a ridge, so you're crossing a valley maybe to get to another ridge, then expect there to be sink just as, in the last half mile or mile as you approach the ridge, and build that altitude in. If your flight computer says, I'm just going to barely clear this ridge from 5 miles away, then you need more altitude or you need to slow down. Pick a lower McCready setting until it says you can clear it by 500 to 1,000. Because I've done it in Condor a few times, and it's a sick feeling when you're approaching a ridge from downwind and think you have it made, and then in that last half a mile, the bottom falls out in the sink, and now you can't make it. So now you have to turn around below ridge height, fly away in sink and rotor. So be very careful when you're trying to cross a ridge from downwind, and always have an out. Build in enough altitude to make it, but have a plan B in case you get there and realize you can't make it. In my book, there's no excuse for crashing because you arrived at a ridge too low. But be aware of where you are. Sometimes people end up on the lee side of a ridge just because they weren't paying attention. They just let themselves drift over. Maybe they were following a weak thermal and let themselves lose their safe glide back to the upwind side, and their thermal falls apart just downwind of the mountain, and now they have no out other than go around the mountain or go downwind. So just be aware of where you are, and don't let anybody but you choose to take you to the lee side. And have a pretty good reason to want to go there before you go there. There's not going to be much good stuff there usually below ridge height. Then of course there's the risk of mid-air collision with ridge flying, because there's a fairly narrow locale of lift, and everybody wants it, especially if there's no other kind of lift around. The worst scenario is the thermals are poor, the only lift around is very weak ridge lift confined to this very small section of ridge, and there are a bunch of gliders. That's a bad situation, and there will be a lot of close traffic, so keep a lookout. We're going to get into right-of-way rules soon here, but more important than anything is just keep your eyes open. Know where everyone is that's anywhere near you. If you're running down a ridge, even in booming ridge lift and big long ridges, and you're racing, beware any blind turns. If you're down there skimming the ridge and you go around a blind turn, there could be someone else coming around from the other direction at the same time, and well, it's too late once you see each other. And beware parked soaring birds. Hawks like to park and just hover, basically, looking for their next meal, I guess. And if you're zipping along at 100 knots, you may not see this little bird till you're all over him and hit him. And you probably don't want that all over your wing or breaking your canopy. Not that you want to kill a hawk either. And obey the right-of-way rules. All our safety depends on it. And now let's get into what those are. One is make all your turns away from the ridge. That Actually, that's not really a right-of-way rule. That's just a safety rule. Because to turn toward the ridge is to turn downwind. And you can accelerate. It can be surprising. And if you're already close to the ridge and you turn downwind, that might not be good. Even if you're a little above the ridge, you may find that you drift so far in that big downwind turn that once you turn back into the wind, you're not even in the ridge lift anymore. You're just back over the top of the ridge. So for safety's sake, turn away from the ridge unless you're plenty high, at least 500 feet over the ridge. Clear all your turns before you make them. There can be people who knows where in ridge lift, so clear your turns, clear them as you're making them, look all around, head on a swivel, looking for other traffic. The glider with the ridge to his right has the right of way. So if you're flying down the ridge with the ridge to your left and you're on a head-on path with another glider, it's your responsibility to move out from the ridge and let him through. So you go around him, he doesn't go around you. Sort of like in America, we drive on the right side of the road, so that's the same sort of thing. If you're overtaking a glider, why is he going so slow and I want to go fast? Whatever. If you're overtaking a glider, if it's at all possible, pass between him and the ridge. The rationale for this is you don't want to trap him between you and the ridge, because if he hits some big sink right now and you're just upwind of him, he has nowhere to go. He has to choose between hitting the ridge and hitting you. So don't put him in that situation just so you can pass. If you're going to pass, either pass between him and the ridge or go around him way far out in front. You could just do a figure eight if you're not in a big hurry. Put some more space between you and him, or just do a 180 and go back the other way if you're not trying to get somewhere quickly. In any case, do it safely. Don't put him in a pickle. And don't tailgate. Don't get right on the tail of another pilot, because he can't see you. He probably doesn't know you're there. And who knows what he's going to do. It really puts a lot of stress on you to have to be watching that closely to react to whatever he may choose to do. He may be flying with extra speed, and he may pull up in a thermal. And now what are you going to do? You're going to slip under him? Hold your speed and slip under him? Or what if he just noses back over and comes back down right on top of you? So just don't do that. Don't tailgate. And for safety's sake, fly at least 10 miles an hour above stall speed when you're less than 500 feet above the ridge. Otherwise, the turbulence can stall you or just push you into the mushy zone where you have so little control you can get turned downwind, slow and low. That's not a good scenario. And I strongly encourage you to always have a safe landing option within easy reach. Now, I know there are pilots that don't follow this rule. Pilots of all types of aircraft that don't follow this rule. Some really good pilots that don't follow this rule, but I sort of like living, and I'd like to live to fly another day. And if you push this rule often enough, one day it might just get you. If you're running relatively low ridges, this is a tough rule to follow. You may have to make a choice between being able to make the cross-country flight you're trying to make and following this rule. If you're flying 600-foot ridges and there's nowhere to land, there's only a place once every 10 miles maybe, you're going to have to violate this rule if you want to keep going. So my thinking is I just don't know that I'm going to set out and try to fly such a task, such a route. Ridge lift can be fickle. Sometimes it can just inexplicably vanish, briefly at least. It could be the sink from a thermal. It could be you find yourself under the downside of a wave. Who knows what reason? The wind might just quit blowing, or some sink might come along. And if your ridge lift band is only a couple hundred feet vertically thick, then it may take a minute or less for you to drop out the bottom of it, and even if the wind comes back up after that, you're done. You're below the ridge lift band and you're landing. So I've learned not to trust ridge lift very much. Maybe I'm a little overly cautious there, but fly safe. I think it's irresponsible in any kind of airplane to not have a safe landing option easily within reach. So ridge soaring can be a lot of fun. It can be useful, but do it safely. Ridge flying is some of the most dangerous type of glider flying, in my opinion. And remember what I just mentioned, that conditions can quickly change and just totally eliminate the ridge lift, possibly causing you to need to land pretty much right now. I've used ridge lift several times in the Sequatchie for cross-country flying, and once I used a ridge on a cross-country flight when that ridge was perpendicular to my path. I just happened to get low at that ridge, and I soared that ridge for probably 30 minutes waiting on a thermal to come through, and finally it came through and I got back up and underway. So you never know where ridge lift can come in handy, but that 30 minutes I was looking at this one field right in front of the ridge, planning my approach into it the whole time and staying within reach. So ridge lift can enter the equation now and then, but I much prefer to just stay above it when I can. That's it. Any questions or comments?